The Sundering, No More Orphans, by Hannibal Taboo. Chapter 1, Where Everybody Knows Your Name. It had been 5 months since the Sundering changed so much and then again so little about life in the Zwari Nation. Despite the entire country being chopped off of its entire world, children still needed feeding, crops still had to grow, and everywhere threats loomed, waiting for opportunity. Adventurer Jaith Kuduri, a tall, vaguely human male with dark skin, shoulder-length cornrows, and piercing hazel eyes, carried a massive caramel wood adamantine axe and a rounded shield with 2 crescent divots carved out on opposite sides. He stepped into the Rutting Boar Inn, a 3-story building which somehow had 9 floors, which was the home base for most of the city of Lefthesport's huge community of adventurers. As a crowd of sellswords and spells for hire rushed out the door of the Rutting Boar Inn, Jaith watched them go with a tinge of regret. A god throwing a surprise quest was always worth noticing, and if Lil Papa was involved, that meant a big payday. Jaith remembered he didn't really need money and had more pressing concerns. He turned back toward the bar where Steelfire had finished with a customer and was returning her attention to him. Steelfire was a towering golden-skinned woman with the blood of Celestials in her veins, rippling muscles in a billowing white short-sleeved shirt that buttoned down the front. Her golden skin and thick golden white braids.
Sorry about that,
she said, leaning his way over the bar.
You know how chatty Keenan can get.
Jaith chuckled, remembering the time the bard Keenan distracted the red dragon Kaida long enough for Jaith and the wizard Hoon to get a group of pilgrims to safety before using Dimension Door to save himself.
Yeah, I get that. I know you're busy, I don't mean to.
Jaith?
She interrupted him.
Who had that clutch scroll of recall when I had to go back to River Run? The fact you didn't end up a smear of paste is a miracle. You need something? I'm your pal. What is it?
He grimaced and looked over his shoulder.
Funny you should mention that day, since I never really understood what was going on. What can you tell me about the Alabaster Assembly?
Steelfire stood tall and crossed her arms, blowing out of breath.
Well, you saw the real problem on River Run, the Elven Beastmaster. He's the one who almost killed us all those years ago before I retired. 4 dozen adventurers, all experienced killers and clerics and mages, set sail from the wharf, set on taking that ring, that vest, and ending the assembly forever. And only 14 made it home.
Jaith said,
The assembly? Break that down for me, please.
Steelfire glanced over her shoulder at her huge greatsword, hanging on the wall over the top shelf.
The Alabaster Assembly used to be part of the Elves' government, the Court Eternal in Elderrest. Their god, the Ivory Betrayer, used to be named something different, but she ran afoul of the chief elven god, Talicia Passandaral. Talicia got the old Spiritus Mundi, Atakarsu, to have the Ivory Betrayer's name and true role stricken from reality. Whatever it is, gods or mortals can't even say it, or write it, or read it anymore. The assembly fought against their god taking this L and lost. 4 of the 5 great elven masters died in the process. This was 2,000 years ago. The Beastmaster collected whoever survived and snuck them out to that island we went to, River Run, about 5 or 6 hours south of town.
Jaith balked.
They're living out on the Sea of Sadness. On purpose? Still?
Steelfire shrugged.
I mean, when you have a vest that helps you control animals and an angry god watching over you, you have an edge on an ocean full of magic monsters. Anyway, for all those years, that's where he's been. Every few decades, people forget what he can do, or find out about what he has, and head out there to get killed. My Baba stopped about 6 groups. but I wouldn't listen. Not many have survived a trip to Riverrun like you, Jaith, let alone 2 trips like I have. Best to avoid it.
Jaith nodded thoughtfully and said,
I'll try. You said this Beastmaster gathered the survivors. Did you see any of them? Maybe a squirrely-looking younger one? Kinda thin and sketchy?
Steelfire furrowed her brow in thought.
On the first trip, we killed a few of his Venators, these fantastic elven rangers of his. Dressed in all white, but somehow invisible in the forests. Some of them were younger, only a few hundred years old. Probably born there.
I think I'm wondering about a magician.
Jaith said,
No weapons, no boots, no cloak, no potions. But he could fly.
Steelfire frowned.
Well, there was a rumor that the Assembly still has people in the nation loyal to the Ivory Betrayer. I haven't heard anything about it in maybe 5 or 6 years, though. And nobody ever had any hard proof. Maybe a subcontractor?
Jaith said,
I think I need to talk to some elves. Who would have the best information?
Steelfire snorted.
Most of the Court Eternal are pretty cagey, especially the ones still alive from back then. I know the Proctor of the Tiger was pretty cool. His whole family is, really. I dated his son, the Rose's Thorn, for about 2 years, and they'd have me up for the solstice celebration. The Dark Rose told the raunchiest jokes I have ever heard from an elf. If you have to chase this down, he's the least likely to throw you out of Elderrest.
Jaith slapped down a platinum coin on the bar and said,
You never let me down, Steelfire.
She eyed the coin and put it in a jar behind the bar marked Jaith and said,
Okay, this one will be waiting for you, like the rest. Strike true.
Jaith stood up and waved to a few familiar faces at tables before stepping out of the massive open oaken door toward the temple square. A single tile of crystalline material stood between the Rutting Boar Inn on the west, the Guild of Clerics called the Restoration on the east, the towering Temple of All Fates on the north, and the almost always congested Fountain Square to the south. Kahari Omalara, the balding, dark-skinned prelate of Orin, gave Jaith a solemn nod in passing, which Jaith returned as he headed south into the crush of people. Chapter 2. Get ready to roll. The Temple Square was normally traveled by 2 types of people, adventurers and religious figures. Just to the south of it, however, the Fountain Square was a true mixing of all of the peoples of the nation. Caravans of wagons, farmers bringing goods to sell, merchants and students and families all walked through this portion of Lephisport to access the city or the wharf district or any of a number of locations. Jaith hung a quick right, not going all the way to get close to the humongous limestone fountain and its central statue of Borzoi, water flowing from each of his outstretched hands. On the right side of Main Street, a friendly dwarven woman with a frohawk and braided beard held a basket of warm, fragrant slices of bread. The powerful scent attacked Jaith's senses.
I can never turn down a scene bakery bread.
He knelt down and took a slice, passing her a gold coin while saying,
Much appreciated.
She winked and giggled back as he stood and stepped across the street towards the fabrication. Throughout the nation, arcane engineers and craftsmen of every stripe worked and traded their wares at places called fabrication, part guild hall, part swap meet. The Lephisport location looked like pieces of dozens of different types of buildings abandoned their places of origin and came together as a hodgepodge conglomeration. Doric columns, medieval battlements, polished marble angles, and craggy, unfinished stone all slapped together in a way that should not stand 45 feet tall. There it was. Jaith stepped into the double glass door and looked up at the dozens of little counter workstations on platforms all along each wall between ladders. In the center of this warehouse-sized space, a huge glass counter full of eccentricities and curios stood at an angle with a gigantic 3.5-foot-long, 2-foot-wide leather-bound book on top of it. From behind the counter, out walked Kivanga Han, a man with wide-set, hooded eyes and a long orange apron over a white sleeveless t-shirt and baggy, grayish pants.
You used all the infusions, didn't you?
Kivanga asked with a chuckle.
Why do you ask me questions when you already know the answers?
Jaith replied, the first signs of a joyful smile cracking his face today. Kivanga chuckled and reached behind the counter to pull out a small sack. From the clinking sound of metal against glass within, Jaith knew that inside there were a few periapts of wound closing and alchemist supplies as well, things he relied upon in the field. As Kivanga handed over the sack, he said,
You know, healing potions from diving across the street are more effective.
Taking off his backpack and putting the sack inside, Jaith said,
I like Davin. Davin's good people. Heck of an apothecary. Davin's not my friend.
Kivanga smirked and gave a knowing nod.
Past the end of the road?
Putting the backpack back on, Jaith extended a hand to Kivanga.
Past the end of the road.
Kivanga grabbed Jaith's forearm and pulled the man into a shoulder hug that Jaith easily accepted. With a smirk and a nod at each other, Jaith turned and left the shop. It was late in the afternoon on this warm, sunny day as the season of the wolf paced towards its apex in 2 months. Jaith retraced his steps towards the temple square and continued north, walking past the Paladin Guild Hall known as the Tabernacle. The clang of weapons on shields and armor hanging in the air like a chorus of praise. The towering overlooked neighborhood loomed on hills on both sides of the northern temple road, the massive mansions and skyscraping estates, a sharp contrast to the congestion of Lethaspor's south side. A brief 15-minute walk, and Jaith found himself under the rectangular northern gate, a stark gray border around it 80 feet wide, the wall itself towering over 50 feet high. Just outside the gate, on the eastern side of the road, was a small wooden stand with a simple red painted sign 7 feet off the ground and white letters reading Midnight Runners. A series of wagons with some kind of yellow magical stone underneath were lined up behind it, and a tall, beige-skinned, scruffy-looking elf with a long nose and tightly coiled black hair stood there, wearing a brown leather vest over a pair of overalls and a thin-brimmed hat balanced precariously on the back of his head. He straightened up, standing about 6.5 feet tall, and smiled as Jaith approached, saying,
Oi, hello. Welcome to the Midnight Runners. What can I... Wait, Jaith.
The elf came from behind the counter and pulled Jaith into a reluctant hug.
Thank you for taking care of things with that trust guy Alejandro, eh? Where are you going on us today?
Jaith chuckled and said,
You don't gotta do that, Dexy.
Eileen.
The elf yelled,
Come on, Eileen. Let's get a northbound seat ready for Jaith. He's going.
Dexy turned back to Jaith and said,
Where'd you say you were going?
Jaith looked down and sighed, then looked back up at Dexy.
Elderest. I'm gonna red-eye it to Elderest.
A buxom elven woman came from behind one of the wagons parked along the northern wall and yelled,
Oi!
She then walked over to one of the mechanical constructs at the front of the wagon and started pulling the levers in its open chest to set it on its path towards a pre-programmed destination. Jaith let Dexy walk him over to the wagon and said,
I won't make you wait for the after-dinner crowd. Off you go, nice and easy. Next time's on you.
Jaith climbed in and found a seat near the middle, next to one of the flaps that could be lifted and used as a window. He checked the secured bindings on his backpack, pulled a dagger and held it in his crossed left hand under his arm, leaned hard against the seat, glanced around, and let himself fall asleep. Chapter 3, the oldest city in the world? After much jostling, many hours later, a mechanical voice sounded out, Express to Elderest complete, as the wagon slowed to a halt. This startled Jaith awake, and he climbed out of the wagon as the first light of day was cresting over the mountain behind the city, seeing a lean elven family stepping out of the wagon ahead of him as he stood at the timeless marble walls of Elderest, the oldest city in the world.
Well,
Jaith pondered aloud.
oldest city in our world.
He shook the thought away as he glanced up at the main gate, 300 feet high, bracketed by statues of a stately elven man and a woman, both dreadlocked, holding hands over the arc of the gate, each holding the other hand out, one with a sword and one with a kind of pita wrap sandwich called an Eternos, popular in the elven region of the Eldria. Behind the gates, thousands of almost identically shaped pointed white towers of almost identical size jutted into the sky, the flawlessly organized grid of the city giving the impression of perfect order, extending miles and miles back to the mountain and a ledge-like cliffside platform called the Shelf. The protectors of Eldorest, elves in glorious golden shimmering ponchos, milled about the gate as traffic moved on to the city's central street, Elria Avenue, in and out of the city unabated. Jaith nodded to a protector he didn't recognize, briefly remembering helping his mother put her green poncho on, and started walking briskly toward the pedestal, the literal seat of elvish power. He glanced toward the mountain, seeing the sun still cresting it, and figured he might have a little time to kill. He veered off to the south down Ralenov Boulevard over to Udakufu Avenue, one of the city's ritziest and most expensive areas. While the towers of Eldorest were almost all intentionally completely identical in composition, they varied in height and demographic composition. The high towers of the northeast, where the mountainside was almost reachable from their windows, to the gray tower and its slightly grimier environs in the southwest, where the hue of less stringent maintenance around the base of the towers gleamed less than those in other parts of the city. Jaith approached the bakery with no name, possibly the nation's most exclusive spot for baked goods, and he was elated to see only 5 people in line outside the door, meaning something could be acquired in less than half hour. He rushed to hop in line, with 3 elves soon standing behind him within the next moment or two. Glancing at the always heavy protector present on Udakufu Avenue, he barely had to wait 5 minutes before he was able to step inside and stand behind one person in front of Amit Kassem, widely known as the Fluff Fascist. Amit was a 5'4" tall, tan-skinned elf with a slick pompadour and a pencil-thin mustache, who stood on something behind the counter that made him able to look down at most customers. The elf in front of Jaith, an older woman, was taking too long to choose her cruller, and Amit yelled,
"You get no sweets today! Out! Out of my bakery!"
Sighing, she complied, shuffling slowly. Glaring at Jaith, Amit yelled,
"You, pretty eyes, what do you want?"
Apple fritter, churro, cruffin, cinnamon roll, plain coffee, please.
Jaith said confidently, but quickly. Amit squinted at Jaith, regarding the adventurer for a moment, before reaching down without looking to pull the requested pastries and place them in a pink paper bag with fancy lettering reading TBWNN. Never breaking his stare into Jaith's eyes, Amit handed the bag over and said through gritted teeth,
"Coffee sold out today, 48 gold."
This was much more than some people in the nation made in an entire year. But the life of an adventurer had certain financial benefits to make up for the near constant threat of death. Without hesitation, Jaith handed over the coin and nodded respectfully.
"We will see you next time, Jaith Kuduri."
Amit spat out, the name sounding like an insult in that tone. Jaith nodded again and spun on his heel, exiting the bakery, letting it roll off his back. 6 steps outside of the front door, Jaith allowed himself a glance back before biting into the fruit. Multiple wizards had cast detect magic near these pastries and assured Jaith that there was no arcane, divine, nor eldritch element to them. Still, anything to taste this good and not be magical seemed to fly in the face of logic. A number of passerby elves smirked, recognizing both the bag and the expression. Located a block south of the bakery with no name, there was a spacious and lush park called the Verdant Vale on Okonkwo Avenue, right behind the hotel on Hollow. This park had wide, sweeping paths, bridges over burbling brooks, and green spaces that spread several blocks to the south. Jaith, who found it a restful place and loved to visit, headed that way with his bag of pastries. About 3 minutes' walk into the Vale, Jaith found an unoccupied bench with no one around. He took a seat, glancing around at the manicured natural glory, and took a deep, appreciative breath. He then tore into the pastry with gusto. As he ate, Jaith heard a female voice say,
"Mind if I join you?"
He turned around to see an elven woman holding a pink cup of coffee from the bakery with no name, steam swirling up from its top like a taunt. She was wearing a very wide-brimmed, black-banded purple hat and wore a stylish gray dress that cinched at her slim waist and was puffy at the shoulder. She carried a handbag on a gold chain that was basically a flat combicat leather rectangle. Her smooth skin was a darker shade of brown than Jaith, and a faint sheen of glitter floating around her face, a common and minor magical effect of high-end makeup available for sale was visible. Without hesitation, but also without any real intention, Jaith said,
By all means.
She demurely said,
Thank you.
and sat down next to him with a smile, sliding the cup towards him. Jaith squinted at her. There was no one else anywhere near the two of them, and when he walked up, he hadn't seen anyone within at least 500 feet. He was very observant from a life of almost dying, and did not hear her footsteps approach. She sat, legs crossed at the knee, hands crossed on her thigh, one holding the handbag in a position that didn't seem threatening, but clearly had purpose. Jaith said,
You obviously know who I am. Why don't you introduce yourself?
She nodded her hat at him and said,
Me? I'm Ethrina Castlemaine. What makes you think I've come here to find you specifically?
For a moment, Jace felt something like a fleeting thought dancing through his mind. He steeled himself and shook it off, but immediately recognized the feeling of someone probing his memories and failing. He glanced at her hand, farthest from himself, and saw the remains of a copper piece dissolving into nothingness. He glanced at the cup of coffee on the bench and looked directly at her to say,
Please don't.
Again, that smile, wielded like a rapier.
Sorry.
She replied, holding up a conciliatory hand.
Habit. I understand you're here looking for information about certain problematic elves.
Jace picked up the cup of coffee, sniffed it, then set it back down while fixing a skeptical look upon her.
Really?
Yes, really.
She replied, attempting a note of sincerity.
Okay.
Jaith said.
This is of interest to you because...
He took a bite of his cruffin while she said,
Let's just say I work for people who want the nation protected from such problematic elves.
After swallowing, he nodded and said,
Then you know my history.
That smile again, as much a weapon as the axe on his back or the blades at his side.
I know your history very well. For example, I also know what's in that Davia bank vault you have. I'm not interested in that, nor are any of my employers.
Mildly irked to have his secrets put on display, Jaith forged ahead, saying,
How may I be of assistance?
As Jaith went to work on the cinnamon roll, Ethrina looked across the park as a small frigate bird landed on a tree, glanced around, and flew off.
It's been some time since there were any rumblings about the people you want to research,
she said lazily.
When we find things, we investigate as quickly as we can. I wasn't fast enough to get on your midnight runner, but I was able to find out where you were going and get ahead of you.
Didn't make much of a secret about it.
Jaith admitted. Ethrina laughed, a rich sound with actual amusement in it.
No, you didn't.
She agreed.
Let's say those who sit in the shadows are interested in this kind of information.
Jaith frowned as that response triggered a vague memory. He remembered being in school and seeing images of various people sitting on the shining throne. Always, in every picture, was a figure impossible to discern, sitting on the shadow throne, its back to the shining throne, just a silhouette. Always the same shape, always the same pose. Everyone knew who had the blessing and sat on the shining throne. Maybe a handful of people in the entire nation knew who sat on the shadow throne, which issued directives in secret that were normally better left unknown. Jaith considered his words carefully and said,
I'd rather avoid falling under the shadow. So if there are things that need tending to that I might be able to assist with, by all means, just let me know.
Well, we spoke with your friend the Count.
She said. Jaith thought back to encountering the Lord High Constable of the majorcratic city Davia a day before. Resilient, a mountain of a brown-skinned man in a waist-length green-shaded half-cape off his left shoulder, with dreadlocks like cords of rope and a thick beard, had been a mentor to Jaith's parents, and like a benevolent but wildly dangerous uncle to Jaith. Had the desire been there, Resilient would have made sure that Jaith could have followed in the footsteps of his fallen parents and served as a protector of Davia. That wasn't what Jaith wanted, but the respect remained after the elder Kuduris fell in the line of duty. Resilience sent some of his most trusted protectors to investigate the site, where Jaith encountered what looked like a sorcerer of the Alabaster Assembly, the site of the abandoned horde of the ancient green dragon Harptaker, slain by the Fractal clan years before.
Okay.
Jaith said, not wishing to give up too much about a man who just bought him lunch from Batter and Salt not a day before. Ethrina continued.
The good count wasn't as forthcoming with information about where you had this incident, which I'm guessing is because it's where you got what you put in your Davia vault. Again, I don't care about any of that. I'm interested because we would like to investigate the site ourselves to see if your new challenge might have left anything behind.
The Count has probably concluded his investigation by now.
Jaith conceded.
I don't see any harm in giving it to you. You have some way of recording the information?
She tapped the temple of her head with her finger and said,
Oh, I can remember if you let me.
Jaith frowned and said,
What can you and your organization do to help me with my part in this?
Ethrina smirked, opening her handbag and said,
I have it on good authority that getting an audience with the Court Eternal is not always so easy.
She pulled out a rectangular piece of stiff gray paper with a border of silver foil around it and a reddish-orange tiger-striped stamp on the center. She held it toward Jaith and said,
This will get you in the right doors as soon as you'd like.
Jaith shrugged and took the paper, glancing her way and thinking of the spot on Lake Kirik where his parents found and secured what became his inheritance. Ethrina nodded, with her eyes closed, mouthing the name of the location.
Lake Kirik. Got it?
She opened her eyes, smiled, and said,
Voluntarily, of course. We would love to have you come by for a debriefing, if that's not a challenge for you. I'm staying at On Holiday in room 777. You would have the gratitude of people who are very good to have on your side.
Finishing up his pastries, Jaith said,
I do like to make friends. Once I've completed my business with the Proctor, I'll see if I can make some time for you.
She stood up and gave a small curtsy and said,
Then I wish you a lovely morning. Enjoy the coffee.
Jaith glanced at the cup again and then back to her shapely form, stepping away. Frowning, he picked the cup up and took a careful sip.
Hazelnut, my favorite. No hint of poison or arcane surprises.
He shrugged and took a long drink, enjoying it after all. Despite inhaling multiple pastries and a pretty large cup of coffee, Jaith felt sated but still light. Taking another look at the past he'd been given, he regarded its fine crafting and quality. Standing up and tossing the empty bag and cup into a trash can near the bench before setting off to the northeast. Chapter 4, The Proctor of the Tiger. The streets of Eldorest were alive with the gentle burbling of conversation. In this part of town, there was a strong protector present. Having spent some time in the Eternal City tracking down the suppliers of a dangerous lich, Jaith knew his way to the pedestal, a wildly different bit of architecture in the largely homogeneous skyline, well enough. After dodging a field trip of elven children who had learned thaumaturgy and were making quite a run, he began to climb the steps towards two heavily armored protectors standing guard when a lightly armored figure, a heavy broadsword on his back, stepped out.
What are you looking for today?
The figure said brusquely.
I'm Levan Harper, Paladin of Orin. And what do you need today from the Court Eternal?
Talk to the Proctor of the Tiger.
Jaith responded, handing over the gift from Ethrina.
The Dark Rose?
Levan looked suspiciously at the paper and took it gingerly, saying,
The Proctor doesn't just see anybody off the street, sir.
He then read the paper and looked back up to say,
I'm presuming you are this Jaith Kuduri?
Jaith nodded, eyes locked with the paladin, and said,
I am.
Levan frowned, handed the paper back and said,
I stand corrected, fair enough.
He tapped one of the protectors on the shoulder pauldron, and they both stepped aside, making room.
Follow me, please.
Levan said to Jaith and stepped inside. Inside the massive edifice, a long white marble hallway sprawled out with finely set stonework and 30-foot-tall ceiling, complete with a catwalk surrounding an opening for the pedestal's central section. This is where the Court Eternal ruled on matters of importance in Elven society. Some of the dozen rotating seats were visible straight ahead to Jaith's left, aligned in 2 rows, with 5 chairs shrouded in white cloths on a pedestal behind them. Turning right, Jaith was led towards a massive staircase with a turn 40 steps up, turning left and then up another 40 steps to the catwalk. The paladin walked ahead past a number of huge closed doors with iconic symbols on them: dragon, rooster, dog, and so on, until finally coming to a door with the head of a tiger on it. Levan turned and said,
I don't know exactly what's going to happen to you in here, so here goes.
He turned back to slowly open the door and leaned in, saying loudly,
1,000 pardons, Proctor. You have a visitor. He was sent with regards from the insinuation.
The comment was greeted with silence. So Levan turned and said,
All right, he didn't say no. You just go in and hope he's in a good mood today. Good luck.
Levan held the door open and gestured for Jaith to enter. With a sigh, Jaith stepped into the doorway to see an outer office like a reception area. The entire room was completely trashed, with crumpled spell scrolls, broken potion bottles, and a variety of broken furniture and detritus everywhere. Pictures of an elven family hung askew on the wall, and there were marks like a staff of some sort smashed in parts of the wall as well. A desk there was smashed in half and lying in pieces, with a chair behind it overturned. Jaith did note, with some surprise, signs of Azizium, a very rare element that could be used in exchange for any material component in a spell, jammed in space. He recognized it from its specific eldritch glow. There was a brick of it underneath some wooden planks, more than Jaith had ever seen in one place at a time. On the far side of the room, a finely made wooden door was ajar, with a darkened room behind that and occasional sparks of light visible. Jaith continued on to the second door, pushing it open and seeing another room coated in debris with a massive oaken desk dominating the space. Behind the desk, illuminated by 4 floating spheres of white light, sat a tall, bald-headed elf with the tattoo of a blood-red rose on his forehead. He had a pair of goggles on and was fiddling with an arcane tool and tweezers, examining a green metal ball with the letter B emblazoned on its side. He had a scale mail shirt on and sweeping purple sleeves and shoulder pads, seemingly floating of their own volition. The elven man didn't even look up as he said,
What?
Jaith stepped closer and said,
I have information about the Alabaster Assembly.
The elven man stopped, set the tweezers and arcane tool down, and turned to look at Jaith, a gaze with enough intensity to bore a hole through a mountain. He asked,
What do you mean, young man?
Knowing how old members of the Court Eternal might be, Jaith stifled a chuckle and said,
The Alabaster Assembly is under the impression that I have something in my possession that would assist them in somehow connecting with or uncovering information about their forbidden god. This...
The Dark Rose stood quickly, close to 7 feet tall, his long pointed ears moving as well. His long reddish cape sprawled out behind him like a suburb. He gestured, and a toppled chair moved from the debris, quickly dusted itself off, and slid behind Jaith.
Please, sit down.
The Proctor's heavy intonation said. He walked around the front of the desk and sat on one edge of it. Jaith took the seat as requested.
When did this happen?
The Dark Rose asked, carefully scrutinizing Jaith as he did.
Less than a day ago.
Jaith answered. The Dark Rose stroked his heavy white beard thoughtfully, still regarding Jaith. He glanced around and said,
My apologies for the state of my offices. I wasn't expecting company. One moment.
He pulled a small piece of fleece from a pouch at his left hip that also held a small warhammer, made an arcane gesture with his left hand, and uttered a word Jaith didn't understand. Suddenly, the entire room was cleaned up, with bright light everywhere, the bookcases fully stocked, and whatever he was working on, gone from the now spotless desk.
Sorry about that.
He said, his tone a little less confrontational.
You're one of those battle magi, aren't you? Some arcane abilities, I'd imagine. Would you mind if I made a brief investigation of your memories?
Thinking about some things he'd rather not have popularly known, Jaith said,
As long as you don't go floating around in there too much. But I don't suppose you have the time or interest in such a thing.
The Dark Rose let a rueful smirk curl up the left side of his mouth as he said simply,
I don't.
He reached for his desk, and from seemingly nowhere, a copper piece came out of the desk and floated into his hand. He spun it in air, and it disappeared as he made a different arcane gesture. And Jaith reeled backward, feeling the Proctor pushing through his mind. After a split second, the Dark Rose frowned and sat back, the feeling disappearing from Jaith as quickly as it came.
He's still alive.
The Proctor muttered to himself. Jaith shook his head, trying to clear the strange feeling like someone had poured ice water through the grooves of his mind.
Well, Kuduri,
The Dark Rose said.
I have good news and I have bad news.
That's how it usually goes.
Jaith said, blinking. The Dark Rose stood and said,
The good news is that you have attracted the attention of possibly the stupidest member of the Alabaster Assembly, the Archmage Jasper Hagrid.
Thinking about the Dracolich he handily dispatched, Jaith said,
I figured with the way things went down.
The Dark Rose continued,
The bad news is that he remains an enormously dangerous, powerful magician.
Copy that.
Jaith agreed.
When I found out what the assembly was, I assumed he had some danger to him.
The Dark Rose said,
As stupid as he is, I really hoped he'd have found his end by now. Hope.
He paused to glance around the room.
It's not what it used to be.
Turning back to Jaith, he said,
I was only looking for raw information as I was in a hurry. What are you looking for here, Kuduri?
Our introduction was not the best, and he attempted to kill me.
Jaith said,
I would like to figure out what I need to do to dissuade or eliminate him. As for future interactions, knowing that he's the dumbest does give me some hope that this won't escalate in a manner that I won't find pleasing.
Well,
The Dark Rose frowned.
he is the third most powerful magician on River Run.
Unfortunate.
Jaith responded,
Luckily, the second most powerful magician never leaves their accursed island.
The Dark Rose said, walking back around the back of his desk.
And the most powerful of them doesn't normally care about much of anything. I honestly hoped they'd all just have the common decency to die in exile. But that was clearly too much to ask. All right. He's not going to give up because the thing he's looking for, that idol to the ivory betrayer that he believes you have stashed away, would make him be considered less of an idiot than the facts clearly indicate. He's looking for approval because no one else believes it still exists. I'm curious how he found out about it and how Heartaker got it in the first place. What politics are at play there? The fact that you inherited this green dragon's hoard is of no importance to me or to the court. But if this idiot found out what you have, others might be able to as well.
How many others would have interest in this object?
Jaith asked,
Anyone in the court would be interested in destroying it to be thorough in wiping the ivory betrayer from the face of the plane.
The Dark Rose replied casually,
Despite the fact that destroying such an artifact would be very costly, and that where it likely is can't be found by any arcane practitioner, and no one but you can access it. It's probably safe and sound where it is. The Bank of Davia cannot be coerced, cannot be changed, so that's all fine.
I still have to deal with this Jasper pushing me into surrendering it.
Jaith frowned. The Dark Rose let loose a laugh, a very surprising sound given his demeanor thus far.
Him? You can break him. He's stupid. He might be 1,100 years old, and he's probably the youngest person on River Run, and not the sharpest blade in the armory. Either you deceive him somehow, replicate it somehow that's convincing enough to fool a fool, or you move him into a position where your axe can do what it does.
I? Or we?
Jaith asked hopefully. Another rueful smirk.
As much fun as it would be to kill Jasper, I am burdened with other obligations demanding my time.
Jaith shrugged.
Perhaps you have an associate that is not.
The Dark Rose cocked his head to the right and considered that. He reached toward the desk, and a sending stone drifted up into his hand from nowhere.
Take this.
He said, offering it to Jaith.
I've got an idea on a couple of people who might be interested in this. But I'll have to reach out to them. That will allow us, once a day at least, to keep in touch. Oh, and please, show me whatever you were given that got Levan to bring you up here to me.
Jaith handed over the square paper from Ethrina. The Dark Rose's eyes glowed blue quickly as he examined it, and the paper began to spin on his tip in his hand before bursting into a flash of flame.
She packed an illusion in here with us.
The Dark Rose chuckled mirthlessly.
The Nation Spy Network has taken an interest in your investigation. They excel at trickery and folded in a small aberration into your invite. I forgot how complicated these games can be. If you'd like to take it up with them, go as high as you can in the Oran Tower in Het Katen and keep yelling that you need to see Seven Thorn over and over. Someone will come out to find you. Fast.
I'm supposed to meet with a woman.
Jaith said, thinking back to the park.
The one called Ethrina Castlemaine.
The Dark Rose asked.
That was likely not her name. I'm aware of her operations around Elderest and even in Jabari. You can go to her, or go straight to the top.
Never hurts to make friends.
Jaith smiled.
And the higher ones are not usually the ones who undertake endeavors themselves.
A valid point.
The Dark Rose conceded.
You are indeed crafty, Jaith Kuduri.
Jaith stood up and said,
I don't want to take up any more of your time, and I very much appreciate the information you were able to give me.
The Dark Rose nodded.
Everything is, I will say, a favor of the court. However, if you do find out more about the Assembly's activities, please visit the Proctor of the Dog or one of our 3 high magistrates. One of them will be very interested in any information about this. The magistrates, Carlos Chan, Adisa Gray, or Romy Lopez, are likely easier to reach than a Proctor. I had a chance to kill Jasper 700 years ago, a bit before the Nation was founded. I didn't, but I should have.
Jaith smiled and said,
If the opportunity presents itself again, please do take advantage of it.
The Dark Rose came over to kind of escort Jaith out and said,
Even as stupid as Jasper is, he'd never get anywhere near any Proctor. I do wish you success in this effort, as it would do great benefit to the elves, and I will pass along what we discussed to the High Magistrates. Strike true, Jaith Kuduri.
He held out a hand and Jaith shook it in reply.
I do like making friends. Thank you, and good day.
Jaith walked back out of the reception office, which now was likewise completely immaculate. The brick of Azizium nowhere to be seen. All the furniture back in one piece, and every broken thing gone from sight. He stepped out into the hall, and Levan jumped in surprise.
He didn't kill you?
Levan said.
Okay, good. Let me walk you out. Let's not push our luck.
Levan walked Jaith back out of the pedestal, and Jaith glanced over toward the park, deciding on meeting Ethrina after all. Chapter 5. On Holiday. It was a quick walk to On Holiday, where she said she was staying. The lobby of the hotel was easily 10 times bigger than the Running Boar Inn back in Lethasport, 1,000 feet wide, perhaps 1,200 feet deep. Throughout the space, elves and other species decked out in finery sipped from champagne flutes and lounged on the luxurious plush couches as crimson-clad porters in pillbox hats pulled huge carts of luggage out of sight. Numerous flowing fountains and greenery decorated the space, an elegant restaurant tucked away behind a formation of stone 800 feet back from the entrance. A white stone bar off to the right, behind lots of huge ferns, was tended by a squat, older, high elven man in a reddish velvet vest. A massive gift shop as big as the entire noble hall in Lethasport was way in the back off to the left, and near on that side, the dominating main desk loomed with a small wood elf wearing glasses and 2 afro puffs perched upon her head, reading something just below its surface.
This is how the other half lives.
Jaith muttered to himself. He walked over to her, and she looked up and beamed a bright smile.
Welcome to On Holiday, Elderest's premier luxury lodging destination.
she said brightly, smiling up at him.
My name is Charity. It is my distinctive honor to help you today. What can I do for you, sir?
Hello, Charity. I was invited to visit one of your guests, Ethrina Castlemaine, in room 777.
Her smile frozen in place. A brief flash of some kind of recognition registered in her eyes, growing bigger for a split second as she powered through it.
Of course. One moment, please.
She said cheerily. She leaned over the desk, pulling herself up a bit, and spat out a name.
Timon!
To her left.
Come over here, please.
She whispered hard before lowering herself back down. A grim, pale-skinned elf whose head looked like a tube inside the pillbox cap came over, shorter than Jaith, but still on the tall side. He gave a brief bow to Jaith and said in a dry tone of voice,
Yes, Charity.
This gentleman needs to go to room 777.
She said, somewhat forcefully through her smile, her eyebrows saying much more than her words. The newcomer, Timon, frowned for a moment before some kind of recognition dawned on him like the sunrise over the mountain that shielded Eldoret.
Ah, yes, of course.
He said with a thin smile.
This way, please, sir.
He gestured toward the back of the lobby. Jaith nodded and set a single gold piece on the counter, nodding at Charity. Without any variation in her smile or ever taking her eyes off of him, she nodded and slid the gold piece into a bowl that looked like it had about 70 platinum pieces in it. Jaith, only at that point noticing the bowl, pursed his lips and then smiled, stepping away. Jaith followed Timon, who had a kind of bouncy walk, toward the curved tubular section of the lobby near the eastern wall. Timon produced a small stone which, when placed near the wall, glowed with a glyph that looked like one that appeared on them. Moments later, the stone itself slid open, revealing a small chamber within. Timon stepped inside, his hand poised on the wall where it slid open, suggesting that Jaith should come inside. Jaith did so, and the wall slid shut again before the entire chamber lurched upward. Timon made certain to stand right against the wall, his eyes not looking towards Jaith at all. A moment later, the movement stopped and the wall slid open again, revealing a single hallway with one door perhaps 50 feet away. Jaith frowned. He'd been in on holiday before, that one birthday party for that wizard from the Wards of Whimsy who always flirted with him, Serena Sage. This wasn't how the floors were laid out. Nonplussed, Jaith stepped out and flipped a gold coin to Timon.
Thank you, sir.
Timon said as the wall slid closed.
And good luck.
Jaith looked back at the sealed stone wall, looking as if it had never been more than a smooth surface, and shrugged, heading down the hall towards the door. Predictably, the single door at the end of the corridor had a brass plate with the expected room number. Jaith knocked, and it took only a few seconds for a familiar and expected voice to call out.
Is that you, Mr. Kuduri?
It is.
He replied, projecting his voice a little. The door swung open, and Ethrina Castlemaine stood, holding it open.
Aren't you prompt?
She asked with a smile.
That's so helpful. Please, join me.
Jaith stepped into the door and did a quick scan of the surprisingly small space, a luxuriously appointed single room, perhaps 15 feet across by 20 feet deep. A large picture window stared down over Eldoret at the back of the room, with a small closed chest near it. Plush carpeting, soft lighting from lanterns, and comfy chairs appointed the space. Two that have a small round table between them, directly across from a long couch resting along the wall to his right. However, brushing close to the entryway, his shoulder passed right through what looked like a painting's frame. Jaith, well acquainted with illusion, saw that this space was not all that it seemed, which could mean anything.
Interesting decor.
He commented, standing in the center of the space. Castlemaine stood near the couch, picking up a quill and some parchment there, and said,
Please, have a seat. Need something to drink? Or are you hungry?
Wouldn't hurt to have something to wet the whistle.
Jaith conceded, sitting down. With a smile, she walked over to the chest and pulled out a tray with 2 glasses and a pitcher of iced water. She set the tray on the round table near Jaith and took a seat.
Appreciate it.
Jaith said, pouring himself some water.
Out of kindness,
She said,
I'm not going to try to delve into your mind, even though it seems someone else did recently. Interesting.
That could be a lot more.
Jaith said. She smiled and looked at the parchment, saying,
Okay, we'll try it the old-fashioned way. If I understand correctly, you went to Lake Kirik, to the empty hoard of a dragon, and fought some kind of fake Dracolich.
Not as convincing as one would imagine for the third highest member of such a group to be capable of.
Jaith chuckled. Flipping through the notes, she said,
Are you talking about Jasper Hagrid?
Jaith said,
I am.
Castlemaine stopped to jot down some quick notes.
The Proctor of the Tiger told you. So you killed this creature and Jasper ran. What are your intentions moving forward in regards to the information you have?
Jaith shrugged.
Obviously, I have no interest or need to be involved with this individual, but I was told and got the impression from my experience that he will not give up.
Castlemaine sighed.
He can be determined.
So, to make him go away...
Castlemaine squinted at him and said,
No. You want to make a deal. That's very interesting. All right, let's hear your pitch. How could we be of service?
Jaith smiled and said,
I think it's a mutual service. This individual running around the mainland can't be good for anyone. None of us wishes him to continue and accomplish his goal. Anything you might do without me to ensure that he was unable to accomplish his goal could probably be done more easily with my assistance.
You're thinking of tricking him because he's an idiot.
She said.
That was suggested as a course of action.
Jaith admitted.
So you're in need of a duplicate of the item he's looking for.
She said, belaboring the point.
Indeed.
He nodded.
Leading you to us for our specific set of skills.
It would.
She set down the parchment and leaned forward.
Mr. Kuduri, you are caught up in machinations from centuries before your birth. Sorry about that. However, I do believe we could strike a deal. In exchange, the insinuation will require a bit more from you than merely your assistance in toppling Jasper Hagrid. We're aware that you are in the business of making friends, and you've done that through multiple strata of society. We are aware that something ill-advised might be happening. When the time comes regarding some of your friends, we might ask you for a favor. It might be as simple as shaking someone's hand, someone whose hand you've shaken 100 times already.
Jaith furrowed his brow.
I believe I can agree, as long as we'll cause no harm or damage a relationship I formed.
Castlemaine smiled and said,
You will be completely blameless, and anything that happens will only be a problem if this person does something to harm the nation.
Jaith frowned.
I wouldn't find myself allied with them in that course.
Castlemaine laughed, a throaty chuckle filled with a kind of pity.
You'd be surprised what some of our friends get into when we're not around.
I assure you.
Jaith said, holding up a hand.
I would not.
Castlemaine smiled at him and said,
At some point, either I or one of my superiors will have to dig into the specifics of your memories regarding this.
Jaith said,
As we're already forming a relationship, why don't we get situated right now? I don't like interest unduly pointed my way.
She shrugged and held a hand out towards him, closing her eyes. Jaith felt a slight chill pass over his head, but inside the bone.
That's interesting.
She muttered.
Don't poke around too much.
Jaith protested. Castlemaine said,
No, I was going through specific memories. You've seen things you don't even know. Hagrid has flown over you 5 times in the last 2 months. You were fighting most of those times, so you were focused on something else. But I can take more of a panoramic look around, looking for him specifically. He's been following you for a while. How did he find out about this dragon?
Matter of interest to me as well.
Jaith admitted.
Not many know of those circumstances.
Castlemaine muttered.
The insinuation will keep it in confidence. We have no interest in the treasures you keep or the places where they are. We just have understandable concerns about dragons on the loose. You normally operate out of Lethsport, yes? You know the apothecary shop there?
Jace felt the feeling leave his mind and shook his head to clear it.
Davin's place? Yeah.
Okay, the next time you go there,
Castlemaine said, jotting down some notes.
Ask if he has 4 potions of possibility. He'll be able to give you some more information at that point. Should take a day or so.
She reached onto the side of the couch and retrieved a blue banded scroll of recall, one he recognized when getting back to Lethsport, saying,
Oh, unless you have more business in the Eternal City.
Jaith nodded and accepted the scroll.
No, sounds good.
She gave him a brief nod, saying,
Interesting to meet you, Mr. Kuduri.
Jaith gave her a glance and said,
You as well.
before he opened the scroll to recite it, finding himself on the 20-foot-wide recall dais in Lethisport, 10 feet above the main floor of the Temple of All Faiths. The sun shone brightly in the partly cloudy sky, and Jaith looked around at the protectors, people of faith, and wondered what could be next for him. Chapter 6. 7. The Orin Tower was tied as the second highest point in the nation, with its twin, the Borzoi Tower, sandwiching the summit itself, the seat of the Shining and Shadow Thrones, where the nation was ruled. The top layers of the Orin Tower, however, could not be reached by ordinary means of the boxes that scaled the obsidian stone towers themselves. Filled with the machinations of the nation's spy network called the Insinuation, these dozen or so floors are known by the secretive individuals who populate them as the Nightmare Castle. A huge conference room dominated the entirety of the Nightmare Castle's penultimate floor, with a sweeping picture window gazing across the western side of the nation, the fluffy undersides of clouds seeming close enough to touch. In that room stood Seven Thorn, an austere, shaven-headed human woman with rich brown skin and a high-necked, floor-length gray gown with matching brown stripes flowing down each side. She gazed out the window at the setting sun as a flash of energy behind her delivered Ethrina Castlemaine to the room. The shaven-headed woman turned slowly to regard the new arrival.
Grand allegation.
Castlemaine said, head inclined slightly.
Welcome back, Rumor Smoke Show.
Thorn replied,
You have something for me?
The Alabaster Assembly.
Castlemaine said simply.
According to reports from one of the adventures, Jasper Hagrid is looking for an ivory betrayer artifact of no apparent strategic or tactical value, currently in a vault at the Bank of Davia.
Thorn laughed.
Agatha and Nynthia will never give him the parental love he so desperately wants. Especially not with Irla still in the mix. No sign of her, I hope.
No, ma'am.
This adventurer who brought this information to light. Which one is it?
Thorn asked pointedly.
Not that idiot Aquarius, I hope. Or one of those weird fractals.
It was Jaith Kuduri.
Castlemaine said.
One of the whispers downstairs pulled all his memories from me before I reported in. He's an anomaly. A GDI with stellar connections and a slight savior complex based on the death of his parents. Protectors from Davia killed at the noble site.
Thorn frowned.
Kuduri. Where have I heard that name before?
He has quite a resume already.
Castlemaine said.
He's faced down dragons, battled on other planes, has a secret fortune, is closely connected with the arcane engineer prodigy Kivanga Han, yet plays his cards very close to the vest. He is open to working with us.
Thorn raised an eyebrow.
Is that right? But he's a GDI. Well, how about we give him someone he can work with? Someone who has a similar mission. Your base identity, perhaps?
Castlemaine frowned and inclined her head again.
If that's what you'd like, Grand Allegation.
Thorn nodded, staring daggers at Castlemaine. Wisps of smoke drifted off Castlemaine as the high-fashioned visage drifted away, revealing a strikingly attractive, dark-skinned Yuan-Ti woman with shoulder-length black hair, a cloak with wisps of spider webs hanging from it, hardened dragon-scale chainmail, and boots with wings on the side. Smoke Show said in her own voice, frowning slightly.
I thought you said we could keep who I really was after this so I could...
I could spend time trying to get you up to speed on a new identity.
Thorn admitted.
But who you are is both faster and useful, Countess. If Kuduri digs into your father, he'll find your lazy life in spars and your sudden turn to adventure without ever knowing why. We'll say the insecurity attack on the Temple of All Faiths in your hometown was a work of Jasper, giving you a reason to share a quest with Kuduri, and a reason for your work. The prophecy that actually led you to me can remain Our little secret.
Smoke Show nodded in acknowledgement. Thorn handed her a Lethasport banded recall scroll and a fresh teleport scroll that would allow one-time access to this part of the Nightmare Castle, and said,
Only for use if the Whispers say so.
Yes, ma'am.
Smoke Show agreed. She recited the recall scroll and disappeared. Thorn turned back to look out of the window, noticing a heavy rain falling from the water-laden clouds, and pondered.